The morning sun broke through the clouds as Gerald Pops Mitchell sat on his front porch, sipping coffee from his faded Marine Corps mug. The steam rose into the chilly air as he watched the neighborhood wake up. At 78 years old, Pops had lived in this house longer than most people in town had been alive, 43 years to be exact. He'd bought it back in 1982 when the area was nothing but simple family homes with kids playing in the streets and neighbors who knew each other's names. "Morning, Pops," called Mrs. Rivera from next door as she collected her newspaper. She was one of the few original neighbors left. "Morning, Gloria," he called back with a friendly wave. "Gonna be a hot one today." Pops rocked gently in his handmade cedar chair, taking in the changes that had slowly crept in over the decades. What once was a modest neighborhood of working families had morphed into something almost unrecognizable. McMansions had replaced the smaller homes. Perfect lawns stretched like green carpets, looking more like pictures in magazines than places where people actually lived. The Oak Ridge Homeowners Association had formed 15 years ago when the developers bought up the east side of the neighborhood. Pops had reluctantly signed their paperwork, not thinking much of it at the time. Just some rules to keep the neighborhood nice, they said. Nothing crazy. Boy, was that a mistake, he muttered to himself. Finishing his coffee, he could still remember the day he'd signed those papers, the pen feeling unusually heavy in his hand. His late wife, Eleanor, had been skeptical. "Just watch, Jerry," she'd warned. "Today it's what color you can paint your mailbox. Tomorrow they'll be telling you when you can come and go." As usual, Eleanor had been right. God, he missed her wisdom. Pops stood up with a slight groan, his joints protesting the movement after sitting too long. His eyes swept across his property, the only one on the block that still looked like it belonged in the original neighborhood. His small ranch house stood proud with its weathered wooden siding, the rich brown color darkened by decades of rain and sun. The HOA had sent him 17 notices about it in the past year alone. They wanted vinyl siding in an approved shade of beige, tan, or gray. Not happening, Pop said to no one in particular. His front yard was another source of constant complaints. Instead of the perfectly trimmed grass that stretched across his neighbors' yards, Pops had flower beds bursting with Texas wildflowers. Bluebonnets, Indian paintbrushes, and black-eyed Susans created a riot of color. Eleanor had planted the first ones 30 years ago, and he'd kept them going ever since. The bees loved them. The HOA did not. Pops walked down his gravel path. Another violation. Should be concrete or approved pavers, they said, and made his way to the backyard. This was his true sanctuary. A massive oak tree provided shade over most of the yard, its trunk wider than Pops could wrap his arms around. Beneath it sat his pride and joy, a workshop he'd built with his own two hands back in '85, the wooden. Structure was solid and well maintained, even if its red paint had faded to a soft rust color over the years. Inside was Pops's world. The smell hit him as he opened the door, sawdust, machine oil, and leather. The familiar sense of a life spent working with his hands. "Home sweet home," he said, flipping on the lights. The workshop walls were lined with tools, some inherited from his father, others collected over a lifetime of building and fixing. Each had its place hanging on carefully labeled hooks or stored in wooden drawers. In the center sat his workbench, the wood polished smooth from decades of use. He'd been a fix-it man his whole life, first in the Marines, keeping vehicles running, in conditions they were never meant to endure, then as a mechanic at Johnson's Garage downtown for 32 years. Now retired, he spent his days in this workshop making wooden toys for the children's hospital and fixing things for neighbors who appreciated his skills. "Mr. Mitchell?" a small voice called from the workshop door. It was Tommy, the 10-year-old boy who had moved in down the street last spring. "Come on in, kiddo," Pops called, smiling as the boy carefully entered. Tommy was fascinated by the workshop and had been coming by after school to learn woodworking. "Did you finish it?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Pops reached under the workbench and pulled out a small wooden train engine, complete with moving wheels and a tiny smokestack. "Sure did. Want to help me paint it?" As Tommy carefully applied red paint to the engine, Pops thought about how few children came around anymore. Most parents in the neighborhood kept their kids inside playing video games or shuffled them between structured activities. The days of neighborhood kids running free until dinner time seemed like ancient history. What the folks in the big houses with their perfect lawns didn't know, what the HOA board members with their clipboards and violation notices couldn't understand, was that this workshop held more than just tools and wood. In the back corner, behind a stack of lumber, was a small cabinet with a heavy padlock. Inside, wrapped in an oiled cloth, sat his service weapon from his military days, a Colt 1911 pistol, manufactured in 1948. It wasn't something Pops thought about much. The pistol had been with him through 2 tours of duty, then followed him home and into a locked drawer. He cleaned it once a month out of habit and respect, the same way his father had taught him to care for tools. He never expected to need it again. It was simply a part of his past that he kept maintained, like the old photographs of Eleanor he dusted every Sunday, or the medals he kept in a box on his dresser. "Mr. Mitchell, do you think I could make something by myself next time?" Tommy asked, carefully wiping a paint smudge from his finger. "I think you're just about ready," Pop said, watching the boy's face light up. "Maybe a small birdhouse to start." As the afternoon sun filtered through the workshop windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Pops felt a contentment that had been hard to find since Eleanor passed. This workshop, this house, they were more than property. They were the physical memories of a life well lived, and no homeowners association with their fancy rules was going to take that away from him. Real trouble began 6 months ago when Richard Thornton moved into the biggest house in the neighborhood. The 42-year-old real estate developer had made his fortune buying up old properties, tearing them down, and building luxury homes in their place. Within weeks of moving in, he'd gotten himself elected as president of the HOA board. "We need to protect our investments," he announced at his first meeting as president. "Every eyesore in this community is costing each of us thousands in property value." Pops hadn't attended that meeting, but Mrs. Rivera had filled him in the next day as they both worked in their yards. "I don't like the way he kept looking at your house when he talked about problem properties," she'd warned. "Watch yourself, Jerry." She'd been right to worry. The first letter arrived 3 days later, certified mail that Pops had to sign for. He'd opened it at his kitchen table, Eleanor's photograph watching from its place of honor on the wall. "What do you think of this nonsense, Ellie?" he'd asked the picture, reading the official-looking document with its bold headers and legal language. The letter informed him that his property was in violation of no fewer than 7 HOA regulations. His house needed to be painted in an approved color. His wildflower garden needed to be replaced with appropriate landscaping. His gravel path should be concrete. And his workshop, the letter called it an unpermitted outbuilding, was an eyesore visible from adjacent properties that needed to be removed. Pops had laughed and tossed the letter in his junk drawer. But the HOA wasn't joking. A week later, another certified letter arrived. This one detailed the fines that would be imposed if he didn't correct the violations. $100 for the unapproved house color, $250 for what they called unauthorized landscaping, and a whopping $500 for his workshop. "They've lost their minds," Pops told Tommy during the boy's next visit, carefully keeping his tone light so as not to worry the child. "They want me to tear down this workshop that's been here since before your parents were born. They can't do that, can they, Mr. Mitchell?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with concern as he looked around the beloved space. "Don't you worry," Pops had reassured him. "This workshop isn't going anywhere." But privately he was starting to worry. He'd heard stories from other neighborhoods about HOAs taking elderly homeowners to court, placing liens on their properties, even forcing them to sell when they couldn't pay mounting fines. On his fixed income, a modest pension and Social Security, he couldn't afford thousands in fines or a legal battle. The third letter came with photos. Someone had walked around his property taking pictures of every violation. The wildflowers Eleanor had planted, the workshop where he taught Tommy and other neighborhood kids. Even his old Marine Corps flag was flagged as an unapproved display. That's when Pops decided to attend the next HOA meeting. The community center was packed that Tuesday evening. Pops sat in the back, his cap pulled low, listening as Richard Thornton ran through the agenda with the efficiency of someone used to being in charge. When they reached open forum, Pops raised his hand. "The gentleman in the back," Richard said, clearly not recognizing him. Pops stood slowly, his knees creaking a bit. "My name is Gerald Mitchell. I live at 1482 Oak Street, and I've been there since 1982. He paused, looking around the room. "I've received several letters about so-called violations on my property, including demands to tear down my workshop." Richard cut in smoothly. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell. We've documented numerous violations at your address. The board has been more than patient. That workshop," Pops continued as if he hadn't been interrupted, "has been standing for almost 40 years. It was approved by the county when it was built. It's where I teach neighborhood kids to work, with their hands instead of just staring at screens all day." A few parents in the audience nodded, including Tommy's mother, who gave Pops an encouraging smile. "The regulations are clear," Richard said firmly. "No outbuildings visible from the street or neighboring properties. The fact that it's old doesn't exempt it from the rules you agreed to when you signed the HOA covenant. That workshop's been there longer than you've been alive," Pops replied, his voice steady but with steel underneath. "And it'll be here long, after you're gone." A hush fell over the room. Richard's face flushed red. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Mitchell. No exceptions, not even for senior citizens." The way he said senior citizens made it sound like a disease. Pops felt his blood pressure rising but kept his cool. "I think we should consider grandfathering in structures that predate the HOA, suggested Mrs. Chen from down the block. She was one of the newer residents, but her comment earned several nods. "Absolutely not," Richard responded. "That would defeat the entire purpose of uniform community standards. Mr. Mitchell's property is an eyesore that's affecting all of our home values." The room divided quickly after that. Longtime residents and families whose children had played in Pop's workshop stood up for him. Newer residents, particularly those who had paid top dollar for their luxury homes, backed Richard. "We purchased in this neighborhood with certain expectations," said a woman in an expensive-looking blazer. "I sympathize with Mr. Mitchell, but rules are rules. Why should we all suffer decreased property values because one person refuses to comply?" "Because this is a neighborhood, not a corporation," fired back Mrs. Rivera, surprising Pops with her passion. "Gerald Mitchell has been the heart of this community for decades. That eyesore workshop of his has helped dozens of local kids learn skills they'd never get elsewhere." As the meeting devolved into heated arguments, Pops slipped out quietly. He'd seen enough. The community he'd loved for decades was changing, and not for the better. The divide between neighbors saddened him more than the threats to his property. Walking home under the streetlights, he thought about what Eleanor would advise. She had always been the diplomatic one, finding common ground where he saw only conflict. "I'm trying, Ellie," he murmured to the night sky. "But some battles you just can't talk your way out of." When he arrived home, there was a bright orange notice stuck to his front door. "Final warning," it proclaimed in bold letters. The fines would begin in 7 days. The morning after finding the orange notice, Pops was drinking his coffee on the porch when he spotted something unusual. A white SUV with a yellow light bar on top cruising slowly down the street. It wasn't a police car, but it was trying hard to look official. The vehicle stopped in front of Mrs. Rivera's house, and a man in a navy blue polo shirt got out, took some photos of her rose bushes, and made notes on a clipboard. "What in the world?" Pops muttered to himself. He watched as the SUV continued down the street, stopping at several houses. Later that day, a community-wide email went out announcing the formation of what Richard Thornton called community compliance officers. According to the message, these officers would be ensuring the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood and documenting violations for prompt correction. Pops didn't have email, but Mrs. Rivera brought over a printed copy. They sat at his kitchen table reading it together. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Rivera said, shaking her head. "They're acting like they're the police. Did you see that vehicle? With the light on top?" "I saw it," Pops confirmed. Checking out your roses. Are they non-compliant now too? Mrs. Rivera laughed. Apparently they're 2 inches taller than the approved height. I got a warning this morning. 3 days later, the white SUV appeared again. This time it parked directly in front of Pops's house. 3 men got out, all wearing matching navy polos with HOA security embroidered on the chest. One was tall and heavy-set with a shaved head. Another was shorter but muscular with a buzz cut. The third was thin and wiry, with sunglasses pushed up on his head. They stood at the edge of Pops's property, taking photos and pointing at his workshop. Pops watched from his living room window, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. These weren't just annoying bureaucrats with clipboards. These men were deliberately intimidating, chosen for their size and presence. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Pops called out, stepping onto his porch. The heavy-set man turned. "Just documenting ongoing violations, sir." His voice was professional but cold. "You've received multiple notices." "On my private property without permission," Pops pointed out. "That's trespassing." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're authorized by the HOA board to conduct exterior inspections from public areas. We're on the sidewalk, which is common property." They were right about that technically. But the way they were doing it, 3 large men in uniform-like clothing with an official-looking vehicle, felt deliberately intimidating. Over the next week, the community compliance officers became a regular presence in the neighborhood. They weren't just documenting violations anymore. They began approaching residents directly, delivering warnings and explaining exactly what would happen if they didn't comply. Mrs. Chen's teenage son was told he couldn't practice basketball in their driveway after 7 p.m. due to noise ordinances. The Patels were warned about their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. And poor old Mr. Washington, who lived alone at the corner, was reduced to tears when they told him his beloved vegetable garden had to be removed. They told him he had 48 hours. Mrs. Rivera reported during her daily visit with Pops. "The man is 82 years old and can barely bend over. How's he supposed to tear out a whole garden in 2 days?" Pops felt his jaw tighten. "I'll help him." The deal. Next morning, Pops gathered some tools and walked to Mr. Washington's house. He found the elderly man sitting in a lawn chair, staring dejectedly at his tomato plants and green beans. "Heard you could use a hand, Fred," Pops said. Mr. Washington looked up, his eyes sad. "They say it's against the rules, Jerry. Been growing vegetables here for 20 years. "I know," Pops said, setting down his tools. "But I have an idea." Instead of removing the garden, Pops helped Mr. Washington transform it. They moved the vegetables to the backyard, out of sight from the street, and planted approved flowers in the front. It was more work than either of them should have been doing at their age, but neighbors pitched in. Tommy came with his parents to help. The Patels brought water and sandwiches. Even Mrs. Chen and her basketball-playing son spent an afternoon digging and planting. "This is what neighborhood means," Mr. Washington said at the end of the day, looking at the people gathered in his yard. The small victory felt good, but it was short-lived. The next day, the white SUV was back, and this time it parked in front of Pop's house for over an hour. The men didn't get out. They just sat there, watching his house. The message was clear: "You're next." That evening, Pops's grandson James came to visit. He was in his late 20s, a law student at the state university. When he pulled up, the SUV finally drove away. "Who were those guys?" James asked as he carried his overnight bag into the house. "They looked like they were staking you out." Pops explained everything: the letters, the fines, the community compliance officers. "They're not real security guards," he finished, "and they're definitely not police. Just hired muscle to scare people into doing what the HOA wants." James listened carefully, his forehead creased with concern. When Pops showed him the latest notice, this one threatening legal action if he didn't comply within 2 weeks, James shook his head. "This isn't right, Grandpa. They can fine you for violations, yes, but they can't enforce it like this. These intimidation tactics might even be illegal. You should talk to a lawyer." "Lawyers cost money," Pops pointed out. "Money I don't have to spare." "Then I'll help," James insisted. "I know some professors who might take this pro bono. This is about more than just your workshop or your flowers. This is about someone using power to bully people. Pops smiled at his grandson's idealism. You sound just like your grandmother. That night after James went to bed, Pop sat on his back porch looking at his workshop in the moonlight. He thought about all the hours he'd spent in there, all the things he'd fixed and built. He thought about the neighborhood kids he'd taught, including James when he was Tommy's age. I fought for this country so people could live free on their own property, he said quietly to the night air. I'm not backing down now. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't be intimidated in his own home. Not by Richard Thornton, not by those officers, not by anyone. The next morning, he found another notice taped to his door. This one had a court date. The HOA was suing him for non-compliance. The lawsuit notice threw the whole neighborhood into a buzz of conversation. James had gone back to school, promising to talk to his law professors and return on the weekend. Mrs. Rivera brought over a casserole, as she always did in times of trouble. Mr. Washington offered what little savings he had to help with legal fees. Pops thanked them all but insisted he would handle it. I've faced worse than some paper-pushing bully, he told them. Much worse. What he didn't tell them was how the situation was wearing on him. At night, alone in the house, he worried. Not so much about the workshop, though losing it would break his heart, but about what it meant. About people using money and power to push around those who couldn't push back. About what kind of world his grandson and kids like Tommy would inherit if nobody stood up. July in Texas was brutally hot that year. The temperature had been over 100 degrees for 6 straight days when things finally came to a head. Pops was in his workshop, the old box fan pushing hot air around while he worked on carving a tiny wooden horse for Tommy. The radio played softly in the background, old country songs that reminded him of dancing with Eleanor in their kitchen. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the vehicles pull up at first. It was only when the slam of car doors broke through the music that he looked up. Through the dusty workshop window, he could see the white HOA SUV parked at the curb. Behind it were 2 other cars, a shiny black luxury sedan and a red sports E. Pop set down his carving tools and went to the window. He could see Richard Thornton emerging from the black sedan, dressed like he was heading to a business meeting despite the heat. The 3 compliance officers got out of the SUV, all wearing their matching polos and sunglasses. From the sports car came 2 more people, a man and a woman Pops recognized from HOA meetings. Board members, 6 people, all marching up his driveway like they owned the place. Pops wiped his hands on his work apron and stepped outside. The heat hit him like a wall as he crossed the yard toward his house. He wanted to meet them at the front, not let them come around to his sanctuary. This is private property, he called out as he rounded the corner of the house. You weren't invited. The group stopped at the edge of his front yard. Richard stepped forward, a document in his hand. Mr. Mitchell, we're here to conduct an inspection, he announced, waving the paper. According to Section 12.4 of the Covenant, the board has the right to access any property in violation after providing written notice. You've had 3 notices. Pops stood on his porch steps, looking down at them. Written notice is one thing. 6 people showing up unannounced is another. You can mail me whatever paperwork you need to. Richard's face hardened. We're done with the back and forth, Mr. Mitchell. We have deadlines to meet. The lawyer has filed the suit, but we're giving you one last chance to comply voluntarily before things get complicated. The way he said complicated made it sound like a threat. Pops felt a flash of anger but kept his voice steady. My grandson's a law student. He says what you're doing isn't legal. Richard laughed. With all due respect, I think our attorneys know a bit more than some student. Now step aside. We need to document the current state of the violations for the court. Pops didn't move. I said no. Send someone with proper credentials and proper notice, not a gang of intimidators. The heavy-set compliance officer took a step forward. Sir, we don't want any trouble, but we have the legal right to inspect. Not without my permission, you don't, Pops insisted. This is still America. A man's home is his castle. Richard sighed dramatically. "Officers, please proceed with the inspection. Mr. Mitchell, I advise you not to interfere. That would only make your situation worse." The two larger men moved forward, climbing the steps toward the porch where Pops stood. One reached out and grabbed Pops by the arm. "Sir, please step aside," he said, his grip uncomfortably tight. Pops tried to pull away. "Take your hands off me." Instead, the man tightened his grip. The other officer moved past them, heading for the front door. "You're trespassing," Pops warned, his heart pounding. "I'm asking you to leave." "We'll be quick," the man holding him said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, old man." Something in the way he said, "old man," dismissive, disrespectful, sparked a fire in Pops's chest. With a sudden movement that surprised even himself, he twisted his arm free. His old Marine training kicked in, muscle memory from decades ago. The man, not expecting resistance, stumbled back a step. Pops backed toward his door. "I'm going inside. If you follow me, you're breaking the law." Richard was watching from the yard, his face flushed red in the heat. "Just get it done," he called to his men. The officers exchanged glances, then both moved toward Pops again. There was no mistaking their intentions now. They weren't there to inspect anything. They were there to intimidate him, to make him feel small and powerless in his own home. Pops went inside, but they followed, pushing through the door behind him. In his own living room, surrounded by photos of Eleanor and James, by the memories of a lifetime, these strangers advanced on him. One grabbed his arm again, harder this time. "Don't fight us on this, Mr. Mitchell. It'll just make things worse." Pops's heart was hammering in his chest, but his mind was surprisingly clear. He knew what Eleanor would tell him to do: call the real police, document everything, fight it in court. But a deeper, older part of him, the part that had survived war and loss, knew sometimes you had to stand your ground. "Let go of me and get out of my house," he said quietly. "Last warning." The men laughed. "Or what?" one of them asked. "You'll take us all on, Grandpa?" In that moment, Pops made a decision. He broke free of their grip once more and moved quickly toward his bedroom. Behind him, he could hear them following, their heavy footsteps on his wooden floors. He made it to his bedroom and went straight to the drawer beside his bed. With hands that didn't shake despite his racing heart, he retrieved the key to the gun cabinet in his workshop. It had been decades since he'd needed the Colt for anything but cleaning and maintenance. Never once had he imagined using it in his own home. But they'd followed him into his bedroom now, these men who had no right to be there, who had put their hands on him, who thought his age made him weak. "That's enough," one of them said. "Stop making this difficult." Pops opened his bedside drawer and took out the workshop key. Next to it lay something else, an old leather holster with something heavy inside. Eleanor had insisted he keep it there after a break-in down the street years ago. "I told you this is private property," Pop said calmly, turning to face the men with the Colt 1911 held firmly in his hands. He pointed it at the floor, but his grip was steady. "Now you're trespassing and I'm in fear for my safety." The men froze. For the first time, uncertainty showed on their faces. "Is that thing even real?" one of them asked, but his voice had lost its confidence. "That old thing probably doesn't even work," the other added with a nervous laugh. Pops chambered around with a decisive click that echoed in the quiet room. The sound was unmistakable. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," he said, voice steady as a rock. "But this close, I rarely miss." The moment seemed frozen in time, Pop standing steady despite his years, the two men backing slowly toward the bedroom door, fear replacing their arrogance. Outside, Richard was calling out, wondering what was taking so long. "You need to leave," Pop said, his voice firm but controlled. "All of you, now." "Put that thing down," one of the men said. "You're making a big mistake." "The mistake was you putting your hands on me in my own home," Pops replied. "Now go, before this gets worse for everyone." The men edged toward the hallway. Pops followed at a distance, the Colt still pointed safely at the floor. He hadn't pointed it at them. Wouldn't unless they gave him no choice. but its presence was enough to change the power balance completely. As they backed through the living room toward the front door, there was a commotion outside. Blue lights flashed through the windows and a police car pulled up to the curb. Mrs. Rivera stood next to it, pointing toward Pops's house. "Looks like the real authorities are here," Pops said. "Good timing." The men's faces changed from fear to something else. Calculation. Pops could almost see the stories they were constructing in their heads, how they would spin this to the police. "Drop the weapon now," one of them suddenly shouted, loud enough to be heard outside. "He's threatening us, help!" Pops didn't fall for it. He calmly placed the Colt on his side table, within reach but no longer in his hands. "Nice try," he said, "but there's something you don't know about this house." "What's that, old man?" One sneered, confidence returning now that the gun was down. Pops smiled slightly. "Eleanor always worried about break-ins, so when we renovated the living room in '98, we put in security cameras. That one there, in the smoke detector, it's been recording everything since you forced your way in." It was a bluff. The cameras had stopped working years ago, but the men didn't know that. Their eyes darted to the ceiling, uncertain. 2 police officers appeared at the front door, which still stood open from when the men had pushed their way in. One was older, around 50, with salt and pepper hair. The other was younger, maybe 30. "What's going on here?" the older officer asked, taking in the scene. The 2 large men in their matching polos, Pop standing calmly by his side table. "Officers, thank goodness," Richard said, hurrying up the porch steps. "This man pulled a gun on my employees who were conducting a legal inspection." The younger officer looked at Pops. "Sir, do you have a weapon in this residence?" "Yes, I do," Pops answered honestly. "A Colt 1911 from my service days. It's registered and legal, and I only retrieved it after these men forced their way into my home and put their hands on me. I didn't point it at anyone." "He's lying," one of the men said quickly. "We were just doing our job and he went crazy." The older officer held up a hand for silence. One at a time. "You, sir?" he addressed Pops. "You live here?" "Yes, officer." "Gerald Mitchell. 43 years in this house." "And these men?" "They came onto my property uninvited. When I asked them to leave, they grabbed me and forced their way inside. I warned them multiple times they were trespassing." Richard stepped forward, still clutching his paperwork. "Officer, we have every right to be here. The HOA covenant clearly states—" "Hold on," the older officer interrupted. "You're from the Homeowners Association?" "I'm the president," Richard said importantly. "These men work for us as community compliance officers." The officer's eyebrows rose. "Are they licensed security guards?" Richard hesitated. "Well, no, but so they have no law enforcement authority whatsoever." It wasn't a question. "We have the legal right to inspect properties in violation," Richard insisted, waving his document again. The officer took the paper and glanced at it. "This gives you the right to request an inspection with proper notice. It doesn't give you the right to force entry or put your hands on anyone." Mrs. Rivera spoke up from the porch. "I saw everything. Officer Nelson, I called you as soon as I saw them grab Mr. Mitchell. It's all on my phone." Officer Nelson, apparently he and Mrs. Rivera knew each other, nodded. "We'll need to see that footage, Gloria." "Of course," she said, already pressing buttons on her phone. "I sent it to your department email too, just to be safe." The color drained from Richard's face. "Now wait a minute." "Sir," Officer Nelson said firmly, "I need everyone to step outside while we sort this out." For the next hour, the neighbors gathered on their porches and lawns, watching as the police took statements. Mrs. Rivera's video clearly showed the men grabbing Pops and forcing their way into his house. 2 more police cars arrived. The officers spoke with everyone involved, examined Pops's gun, and reviewed the HOA documents. Finally, Officer Nelson approached where Pops sat on his porch steps. "Mr. Mitchell, your weapon is properly registered, and you were within your rights to defend. You're home against intruders. We'll need to hold the gun temporarily during our investigation, but it should be returned to you soon." Pops nodded. "I understand, officer." "As for these gentlemen," Nelson continued, turning to the HOA group, "you're being cited for trespassing and simple assault. You, He looked directly at Richard. Could also face charges for sending employees to conduct what amounts to intimidation under color of authority. "This is outrageous," Richard sputtered. "We'll fight these charges." "That's your right," the officer replied calmly. "But I'd think carefully about that. The DA doesn't look kindly on people who impersonate officials or use intimidation tactics against elderly veterans." As the police escorted the compliance officers to their cars, the neighborhood erupted in quiet conversations. Some looked shocked, others satisfied. Tommy's parents kept him inside, but Pops could see the boy watching wide-eyed from their window. Mrs. Rivera brought Pops a glass of iced tea and sat beside him on the porch steps. "You okay, Jerry?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Just sorry it came to this." "Don't be," she said firmly. "They pushed and pushed until someone had to stand up to them. Might as well be you." The aftermath unfolded gradually over the following weeks. James returned from school with 2 of his professors, who took Pop's case pro bono. The community compliance officers were disbanded immediately. Richard resigned from the HOA board, in disgrace when it came to light that he'd been receiving kickbacks from contractors hired to fix violations. An emergency community meeting was held in the park. Nearly everyone attended, old residents and new, those who had supported Richard and those who had stood by Pops. The tension was thick at first, but as people talked, a new understanding began to emerge. "We don't want to throw out all the rules," Mrs. Chen said. "Some standards are good for everyone, but they need to be reasonable and they need to respect the history of this neighborhood." A retired judge who had recently moved in across from Pops stood up. "I propose we draft a new charter," he suggested. "One that balances property values with community values, one that has input from everyone, not just the newest or wealthiest homeowners." To Pops's surprise, even some of Richard's supporters nodded in agreement. The lawsuit against Pops was dropped. His workshop was formally grandfathered in as a protected structure. The settlement from his countersuit against the former board members for harassment and violation of property rights was modest, but enough to establish a small trust for Tommy's future education. As for the Colt 1911, the police returned it after the investigation concluded. Pops cleaned it one last time, then donated it to a military museum downtown. Its days of service, like his, were finally complete. "Sometimes standing your ground isn't about weapons," he told Tommy one afternoon as they worked on a birdhouse in the workshop. "It's about knowing your rights and having the courage to defend them." The new HOA president, that same retired judge, made it a point to stop by Pops's workshop every Friday afternoon, not to issue violations but to share stories and learn woodworking from the neighborhood's most respected resident. And on warm evenings, the porch that had once been Pops's solitary domain became a gathering place. Mrs. Rivera brought her famous lemonade. Mr. Washington shared vegetables from his new backyard garden. The Chen family's son practiced his basketball nearby, the rhythmic bouncing a counterpoint to the conversation. "Eleanor would have loved this," Pops told Mrs. Rivera one evening as they watched Tommy and some other neighborhood children playing catch in the fading light. "She still does," Mrs. Rivera answered softly. "Through you." The wild flowers Eleanor had planted all those years ago still bloomed in the front yard, more vibrant than ever. No one would ever ask him to remove them again.